Right on. Mission accomplished. Killed all those innocent people. Good for you, Mr. Bush. Well, anyway, I'm actually in a good mood now because I just sold my house and I just bought a floating home. All that time, all these last years, everything's been terrible. The pressure's off, and maybe in a few days I'll even begin to believe it, But I actually have the key. I got the key right now. And the title and everything. Okay, I can't hardly believe it. We switched realties, and all of a sudden, 4 days later, after 6 people saw the house, 1 person bought it. I got my money, and I bought another house in 4 days. After months and months, over a year of messing around. Well, anyway, enough of that. I'm going to try to make a documentary out of it sometime, probably, because there's lots of things people need to know. What started out, my whole problem was counting on the reverse mortgage, and the only thing they didn't tell you is that you can't get one if your house is not FHA certifiable. In other words, already perfect. So when they tell you that you can use your reverse mortgage for remodeling, they're lying and they're telling the truth. They're lying about it. If you have stuff that needs doing now, forget it. You don't even get the loan. But if your house is perfect, you can decide to add a new room or change a kitchen into a bathroom or change a bedroom into a playroom or whatever you want to do. You just can't make your house nice if it wasn't nice. And that's the whole rub. They never said that in any of their literature. It didn't happen until I applied for the loan. And then it was too late. Well, anyway. Okay, so this show started out being 9/11 was an inside job. I changed the name because so many people just kind of get tired and ignore it in the TV guide and so on. And I still talk about those issues. I'm still a member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And there's lots of things in the news, but one of the things I ran across again was Webster Tarpley. It's a little 10-minute clip of Webster Tarpley, who's a genius. He's a historian. He's a socialist. He's got a mind that will remember everything. I mean, yeah, he and Alex Jones are in the same category in that respect. It's just absolutely remarkable, and he does analysis that far exceeds the pitiful excuse that people have for analysis these days. So we're going to play a 10-minute blast from the past, where he's going to be talking about 9/11. So go ahead and let her roll. I'll be back.
The second attack, I guess, is the one that's captured on news film, because he's in the middle of a photo opportunity reading to these, or listening to these children read My Pet Goat in the elementary school class in Sarasota, Florida. My personal analysis of this is that he is frozen in fear, terror, and panic. He does not know what to do. And he sits there waiting for somebody to tell him what it is he must do. He is not an active president. He doesn't call for telephones. He doesn't issue a parade of crisp orders. He doesn't say, scramble every fighter, bring down all planes, close the borders, go to red alert. Nothing of the kind. He sits there, and we know that his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, is in the back of the room holding up a big placard saying, don't say anything. Don't comment. This is obviously not a president. This is a puppet. This is a figurehead. This is a ceremonial figure, if you like. That is how Bush tried to explain his behavior to the 9/11 Commission when he was interviewed. Of course, he had to be interviewed together with Cheney. The reports are that he was sitting on Cheney's lap while he gave this interview. And there are other reports that Cheney was sitting on his wife's lap because that's how he has to appear. Cheney can't appear without his wife, and Bush can't appear without Cheney. So Bush said, I sat there and tried to project calm and strength. Now, this is an absurdity that is verging on pandemonium of insanity. He simply doesn't know what to do. He's got to be told what to do. There's the other dimension, is that as you read, for example, in my book, I devote a whole chapter to Bush's behavior and movements on this day, because I consider it to be of critical importance. A Secret Service agent, hearing the news of either the first or the second plane hitting the buildings in Manhattan, said, "We're out of here." That was standard operating procedure. The standard operating procedure is if a major terror event is in progress, the president has to be taken to a secure location. We know, for example, Cheney, obviously considered much more important, was literally picked up and carried from his office in the White House down into the bunker in the sub basement, where he would probably be safe from a direct airplane impact, maybe. But in the case of Bush, despite the fact that one Secret Service agent says we're out of here, they don't move him. He stays there. Somehow that impulse is overridden. The standard operating procedure is abandoned, and Bush is essentially left there as a sitting duck. I don't believe reports of conspiracy theorists who say, well, they let him stay there because they were all in on it. They all knew everything that was happening. The invisible government, the coup faction or putsch faction behind 9/11 is in the federal government, but they don't issue engraved invitations to their terrorist actions. They confront somebody like Bush with a fait accompli, and we'll get into that perhaps in a second. But they left him there as a very inviting target. There's good research by Daniel Hopsiker that there had been something resembling an assassination attempt against Bush in the morning. A camera crew showed up at Bush's hotel in Longboat Key in Florida on the morning of 9/11 at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And they said, we're here to do an interview. The Secret Service allegedly said, we don't know anything about that interview, go away. The guess might be that it might be a Maqsood operation. In other words, Maqsood was a leader of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. He had been assassinated several days before by a camera crew of suicide bombers who came in, and instead of having a camera, as we do here, I hope, they had an exploding bomb that killed all of them, but killed Maqsood as well. I would ascribe that to the CIA rather than to anybody else, because they didn't want a nationalist like Maqsood running the Northern Alliance. He would have been too difficult to handle. He was somebody who had stood up to the Soviets. He wouldn't hesitate to stand up to the punks from the CIA and the U.S. forces. So, assassination attempt in the morning, hung out to dry, essentially left there, security stripped in the morning. Then Air Force One takes off. No fighter escorts are there. And there's also a tremendous reluctance on the part of the pilot of Air Force One to tell the Air Force where he's going. The reports are that a couple of fighter jets finally appear, but they're simply told, follow Air Force One, we're not telling you where we're going. Doesn't really indicate too much trust in the military. Indicates rather that the people in Air Force One knew that they were in the midst of a military coup, and that Bush might become expendable at any point in the day. And then above all, the centerpiece of 9/11, I think the single most important piece of evidence in the entire day, the incoming threat given to the Secret Service, Angel is next, meaning we will destroy Air Force One. And it doesn't just come with Angel is next, it then comes with a train of cosmic level code words, top secret code words, indicating that behind that threat is a network that has access to the most important secrets of a whole range of executive departments, presumably CIA, National Security Agency, Pentagon, FBI, Justice, Treasury even, the whole array. And that's a threat. The idea is, what they're saying to Bush is, you've got to go on television and start saying, Bin Laden, Bin Laden, Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, 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 and you will remain in office. If you don't, you may be liquidated at any time. You may not see the end of this day. I think to some degree what's most interesting about 9/11 are the things that almost happened but didn't. What happened, of course, was a terrific tragedy, but the things that might have happened were even worse. The other thing the invisible government wanted Bush to do, this coup faction, if you will, was to get on the phone with Putin and tell him, we are seizing Afghanistan now, and we're going to set up bases in your soft underbelly in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia. Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzia for starters, after that perhaps Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and the rest. That is a very dangerous move. That might have been responded to by Putin with his own threats. He might have said no. So the invisible government had to have the possibility of nuclear escalation, and they did. They had it in two ways that we know of. One is that in the Angel is Next phone call, they had code words that seemed to indicate that they had access to the nuclear launch codes, that they were able to somehow access the so-called football, the collection, the briefcases that are filled with these codes that accompany the president but are also kept in other places for use in case of all-out nuclear war. So the perpetrators of 9/11, the coup faction inside the U.S. government, have these codes. They can launch nuclear war that way. There's another way they could have launched it, through an exercise called Global Guardian, because it just so happened that on the morning of 9/11 there was also an exercise simulating all-out thermonuclear war. And part of that exercise appears to have been an attempt, as a part of the drill, as a part of the simulation, for a rogue faction to gain access to command and control systems that would give them the ability to launch missiles. So that might be the concrete, specific backdoor that the invisible government might have used in order to escalate in the nuclear realm if that had become necessary. Essentially, the ultimatum to Bush is either you launch the war of civilizations against the Arabs and the Islamic world in Afghanistan, later in Iraq, you launch it in conventional form, or we will launch it ourselves in nuclear form. In other words, we can incinerate Cairo, Damascus, Tehran, you name it, Kabul, all of those places can be hit by missiles within minutes. We'll do that and leave you to deal with the consequences. Now, of course, one of the overtones of this, and I'm relying here on, just in terms of the sources, the Réseau Voltaire, presumably having the benefit of the French intelligence services. Secondly, Debka, a website that is close, I believe, to the views of the Israeli Mossad. And then another one called Namakon, which is a group of KGB Soviet intelligence veterans. They seem to converge on this hypothesis that there was a nuclear option built into it. And essentially it's an ultimatum telling Bush that the only way you can remain in office is if you begin to preach the war of civilizations and act in the way that we are demanding. There's also reports, through the Réseau Voltaire in particular, that Tony Blair was on the phone actively with Bush, telling him, you've got to go on television and say Al-Qaeda, bin Laden. And of course, for that, there was absolutely no proof. There was no scrap of proof in the world that bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, had anything to do with this. And indeed, the FBI has admitted that in going into Afghanistan, they never found anything, not one line, not one scrap, that would have anything to do with the events of 9/11. So I think the scratching the surface on 9/11, what is revealed is a horror that is much greater than even the one that we saw.
Yeah, and Webster Tarpley is one of the few people you'll ever hear doing an analysis, that deep and deeper. He names names, and it would be really nice to see him and Kevin Ryan key up, team up, I mean. It would be really a team, I think. Well, I hope you're familiar with Greg PALAST. He's one of the finest freelance reporters. He worked for the BBC, and I think he's freelance now, but he's done many, many documentaries. And one of the ways that I first became familiar with him was when he started working with the I was familiar with him before that, but working with the 2004 election and exposing all of the ways that they actually hacked the voting machines and cheated the votes, and the other ways that they cheated too, by gerrymandering and the slick way that they're going to talk about in this clip that we're about to roll. The names that sound like bad people. So if John Smith was in prison in the adjacent state and your name is John Smith in this state, then obviously you're cheating and voting in both states. So they took you off the rolls. And funny how it turned out to be mostly minorities who voted Democrat. Kind of a way to cheat the election. Well, let's watch Greg Palast. This is about 13 minutes, and he's going to tell you what happened to Louisiana and how they systematically stripped it of its black folks.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Dever in Baltimore. This week marks the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It also marks the 8th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And a new report found that African-American New Orleans residents continue to be disproportionately affected by high unemployment. Nearly half of them are unemployed. And also, African-American households are earning 50% less than their white counterparts. Meanwhile, much of the city public education and housing has been privatized or demolished. That's from the Katrina Pain Index of 2013 by Bill Quigley. Now joining us to talk about this is Greg Palast. Greg Palast is a BBC investigative reporter, and he investigated for Democracy Now! The real causes behind Hurricane Katrina in a film called Big Easy to Big Empty. Thank you for joining us, Greg.
Glad to be with you.
So, Greg, what is the connection between this 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and the 8th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina?
Plenty. For those who know Greg Palast as an investigative reporter, most people know that I uncovered that Katherine Harris knocked tens of thousands of people off the voter rolls of Florida in the 2000 election, thereby handing the election to George Bush. People were illegally called felons when their only crime was voting while black. It was an ethnic cleansing of the voter rolls. When Martin Luther King stood up before the Washington Monument 50 years ago this week, he said, "I have a dream that black folk in Alabama and Mississippi and in the South will be able to cast a ballot." Well, 50 years later, we're still asking that question. Of course, we've eliminated the white sheets and the Ku Klux Klan as a threat. It's now spreadsheets and ethnic cleansing. Now, I did the investigation of the ethnic cleansing of the voter rolls of Florida. And by the way, that spread to Louisiana and Georgia. But I also look at the ethnic cleansing of another town, New Orleans, for Democracy Now! And what I found was just stunning. You have to put these two things together. You have to put the ethnic cleansing of the voter rolls of Florida together with the ethnic cleansing that happened and is going on in New Orleans and Louisiana, with Hurricane Katrina just a cover, an excuse. That's all it is. And what you take away from this is that King's dream was announced 50 years ago, but 8 years ago in New Orleans is when the dream drowned. And here's what I mean. I've discovered that Louisiana State University's Hurricane Center sent an emergency request to the White House more than a year before the levees broke, before Katrina. And Dr. Ivor von Heerden, the deputy of the Hurricane Center, contacted George Bush's senior counsel at the White House. They had a long discussion. He said, New Orleans is going to drown. Not maybe, not will. We don't even need a hurricane. Remember, and by the way, Hurricane Katrina never touched New Orleans. It went 30 miles east. It was simply a storm surge. He said, we cannot handle even a storm surge in New Orleans. The levees are too low. The levees are built wrong. And not only that, but you've built a canal for the oil companies, which is bringing the Gulf of Mexico right to our doorstep. This city is going to drown unless you bring in the Army Corps of Engineers to correct this. But the Army Corps of Engineers, remember, in 2004 was in Iraq. They weren't there for the American people. They were there to blow up bridges and then rebuild them over the Tigris River. So what happened is that all the warnings of Dr. von Heerden, and I got to tell you, it's not like these were secret things. British television, where I work for BBC TV, 30 days before New Orleans drowned, just 30 days, von Heerden said on British television, this city could be underwater in a month. Exactly 30 days later, it was underwater. This was not some shock and some surprise. Now, what does this have to do with Martin Luther King and the rights of African Americans to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and democracy? Okay, life and liberty was lost. If this was somewhere else, if this was not an African American city, an overwhelmingly African American city, it would have been protected. I'm speaking to you right now from near West Hampton Beach, which is where the movie stars go for the summer, and the real estate brokers and the venture capitalists and financial vultures hang out for the summer. This area was wiped out by a hurricane twice. And both times, the United States federal government evacuated people, took responsibility. No one's ever hurt here in this rich beach area. Bill Clinton's just down the road. He doesn't even get his flip-flops wet when there's a hurricane. And furthermore, every single house here, and when I say houses, I mean mansions. These beach mansions, every one of them was replaced by the federal government at the public cost, even with hundreds of truckloads of sand brought in, so that the venture capitalists and the Democratic Party donors could get their tans. What happened in New Orleans? I got to tell you, according to a United States federal court judgment, von Heerden was correct. There was something called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Canal, which created basically a highway for the water surge from Katrina, a highway for that surge. It was insane. It was just an invitation for a tidal wave. There was never a hurricane, but there was a tidal wave that hit New Orleans, which knocked over those levees. It was the responsibility of the federal government. And the only reason the federal government did that, by the way, built this stupid canal, which basically drowned New Orleans. It was a shotgun rifle. It was like a rifle barrel pointed right at the city. It was because oil companies wanted to save time. They didn't want to take the Mississippi River all the way to the Gulf, which winds all the way around. Old Man River goes in all kinds of crazy curves. So they built a straight canal for the oil tankers, so the oil tankers could save a day or two on travel down to the Gulf. That's what it was all about. So just oil tankers could save a day or two. The city of New Orleans drowned. The federal courts determined that's exactly what happens. That's the science of it, and ordered the federal government to rebuild the homes of the African Americans who lost their homes, because this was something that was done by the oil companies and the federal government. That's a court ruling. But the federal government, if it loses a court case, cannot be required to pay unless Congress agrees and appropriates the money, unless the president asks. Barack Obama never asked for a dime to rebuild the homes that were lost, the people of the city of New Orleans. Yes, he rebuilt the homes of all the movie stars in West Hampton, but not a single home in the city of New Orleans. I want to repeat that. The federal government has never rebuilt any homes for the people of the city of New Orleans. They gave them formaldehyde-filled trailers. They spread them all over the country, and they drowned them. Not only were 2,000 people drowned by this horrific negligence, willful negligence of the federal government, when they knew in advance this would happen.
Well, Greg, let's talk about the reconstruction and the recovery effort in New Orleans. And specifically, let's talk about the African-American community and how they've fared. What has it been like for them down there post-Katrina?
Horrific. I got to tell you, look, this was, as far as the Caucasian and elite leadership of New Orleans, that's both black and white. Remember that when we talk about there's no African-American community in New Orleans, just so you know. There is an elite black community, which is from the old Creole community, which includes, by the way, the old black slaveholders. There are a lot of black people who owned slaves in the New Orleans area before the Civil War. And you have that old black elite and the old white elite, and then you have the average African-American, worked those plantations and lived in places like the lower Ninth Ward, which, by the way, had the highest concentration of African-American home ownership in America until Katrina. What happened was all these people were shipped out, put on buses, not even told where they were going, and sent to Texas, sent to Baltimore, sent all over, and sent to Florida. No way to return, no plan to return. People weren't allowed to return to their own homes, not even allowed to put trailers on their own property. Not allowed. So when we talk about New Orleans recovering in the sense of like it's up to 70, 80% of its original pre-flood population, that's not the same people. They're gone. Half of the African-American population in New Orleans is gone forever, dispersed. They don't have the money or the ability to get back. They don't have their homes back. They don't have the ability to get back. And so in terms of work, almost all the work of reconstruction was done by people who came in from Salvador and from Latin America. Cheap labor, and then the technical labor came from the north. So basically, it was all carpetbag labor, and local African Americans lost their jobs. There's in our film, which, by the way, if you go to gregpalast.com, you can download it for free this week. Big Easy to Big Empty. You'll see that we had a young black man who stood on a bridge for 4 days while helicopters flew over, ignoring him and the people he was with. A grandfather near him gave his last bottle of water to his grandchildren, and then he died of dehydration on that bridge. Then Stephen was put on a bus, separated from his family. He never saw his children and his wife for weeks. He had no idea where they were shipped off to. And then he was dumped in Texas. He ended up taking a job in Texas and his job at the Marriott Hotel in New Orleans was taken over by immigrant workers who would be willing to work non-union and at half his pay. So you had basically the construction work was done almost entirely by immigrant workers as opposed to the black population which had lived there. So basically the black population was cleansed out of the city and off the voter rolls, so that you actually don't forget. This is also another way to get rid of, to use a natural disaster as a cover to, in effect, cleanse the voter rolls as well. The state went from Democratic governor to Republican, Bobby Jindal. Altogether, the New Orleans went from a black city to a white and Latin American city. It's a very different city than it was.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Greg.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Okay, the Real News Network is really good for all kinds of things, and I think we're going to make a clean sweep of it this time. All the videos on the show today are from Real News Network. Well, so you heard about the systematic brutality in Katrina, and it makes me wonder, there's something psychological about these organizations, not particular organizations, but organizations in general, where they become an entity, a beast of their own that lives regardless of the people who run the system. They come and go, and the beast stays the same. It doesn't get any less hungry when you get nice people in it. People who would never do anything if they met you face to face, would never treat you bad, but acting in behalf of their company, they can do all kinds of horrors and not even flinch. And then afterwards, when they have a chance to reflect on it, obviously they don't. So, I wouldn't either if I had that type of crippling thought in my head, and only a margin of not thinking about it kept me from going insane. But, okay, there's more problem. What do you think about when you think about black leaders in the United States? What do you think about that? Well, they haven't been telling you much in history class about black activism. They haven't been telling you about the tremendous amount of success that black activists have had. And in fact, what we're witnessing is a systematic rewriting of history to eliminate any of these successes, so that the present day black children growing up don't have a connection. They don't have a sense of accomplishment as a group. They don't have a feeling of fitting with a group. And that's not a coincidence. That's not an unintended consequence. So if you thought about Martin Luther King, Al Sharpton, Louis Farrakhan as leaders, well, that's what they want you to think. But they aren't the black activist leaders. They're the ones who usurped the system after the black activists actually accomplished something. So let's go ahead and run this clip, and I'll be back in about 13 minutes.
What's up, world, and welcome back to another edition of I Mix What I Like here at the Real News Network. I'm Jared Ball in Baltimore. As new generations of activists enter political struggle here in the United States, they enter into a vacuum created by this country's most aggressive repression of revolutionary movements. Assassinations, exile, and long-term political imprisonment have left many of the most seasoned and politically educated revolutionaries incapable of having the requisite influence on successive generations of activists, and influence vital to the success of such movements. Our guest in this segment of I Mix What I Like has recently written a number of provocative public commentaries calling to task several prominent and aspiring black leaders and organizations who are beneficiaries of and replicants of what he has called stealth history. Dhoruba bin Wahad is a former political prisoner and member of both the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army, and is one of our strongest political analysts still willing to perform that function. We welcome him to the show. Welcome, Dhoruba, to I Mix What I Like here at The Real News.
Thank you for having me on, Jared.
So as I sort of said at the beginning, you have written these commentaries in response to what I'm describing as a vacuum of leadership created by COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program, and the repression of in this case, black liberation struggle in the United States. You've been critical of the Nation of Islam's Million Man March, the 20th anniversary coming up here in a few months. You've been critical of the new Black Panther Party and its leadership. And so if you would, take us through a little bit of this argument of yours and what you've been calling stealth history.
Well, actually, it's a term that was coined by Eric Cummins. Back in the early 1990s, and he was pointing out how a number of publications were put out by the mass media, purportedly by former Black Panthers or individuals that had close relationships to the Black Panther Party leadership, and these individuals turned out to be, for the most part, police agents. One of them was a young Republican who went underground and wrote these books, Spitting in the Wind, and these other publications, in which they just flat out lied about prominent leaders in the Black liberation movement in general, and particularly the Black Panther Party. And this history has been, this revision of events has been allowed to percolate and marinate because of the rise of a new comprador class that we have that we had after the 60s and early 70s. That new comprador class, of course, is, as I indicated, mainly derived from former allies of Martin Luther King and the nonviolent integrationist movement. These individuals and organizations abandoned poor people in order to have a place at the table, at the corporate table, at the table of empire.
You've raised, I think, important critiques here. You were critical of, you've long been critical of the Nation of Islam and its, as you've called it, messianic approach to struggle here. You were critical of Al Sharpton, the National Action Network, and of course the new Black Panther Party for its, claiming the logo and name in many ways, but absent the analysis and the programs of the original Black Panther Party. My one question, I would like to get into some of the details of those arguments, but my one question to you initially is, what do you say to those who argue that public critique of other black leaders and organizations that are ostensibly trying to do some good is a flaw? It's a flawed approach and something that holds us back. How do you first address that critique that I know you've heard and that I've heard many times over the years?
Because we're making an assumption that the people that we're supporting and the people that we've failed to critique are actually advancing an agenda of black folks. We're making that assumption because of their pretense, because perception is reality. I mean, we look at organizations and they have these nice uniforms and they seem disciplined and they seem organized. But when you look on the reality, what do we have in terms of political empowerment? Do we have an independent black political party? Do we have an independent political party that represents all of the people who are maligned by empire in the United States, or whether they're immigrants, whether they're Latinos, whether they're gay and lesbian? Do we have this type of political organization given this type of leadership? No. What we have are organizations that parade around and show discipline and give fiery speeches that the right wing uses to organize and raise money with. And on the other hand, when we look in the black community, we look at these organizations, they'll call, like, we had a Million Man March and we had a follow-up to the Million Man March. And the issue is not so much that you're calling black folks together. The issue is, what do you do when you do call them together? And also, how do they come together? When you look at and anyone that knows what I'm talking about, any activists in any of these cities know I'm telling the truth. You cannot have unity and don't have principles. When you have an organization, any organization that wants to claim a national following, a significant influence on the masses, and then it goes into the communities and it calls together all the activists who are actually doing the work on the ground in the community and say, look, we need all to come together in Washington, D.C. on this date and demand A, B, C, and D. And then the organizations go out and they do all of this work. They mobilize the people. They raise funds. They go knocking on the doors to turn people out. These are the activists. These are organizations on the ground who are doing this. This is not the people that's calling for this convocation. They're not doing anything. So when you do wind up with a mass demonstration, they're the ones that's on the stand, they're the ones that's on the podium, and they have no program. They have nothing to offer. They have no strategic vision. They have no analysis. All they do is give you an emotional speech. All they do is rile you up and then tell you to go back to your place and continue to do what you've been doing before you came there. And then it's gone. It's done. It's a done deal. Okay, this happens time and time again. The National Action Network does the same thing in a different way. You remember the national rally that they called for justice, and they had demonstrations in over a dozen cities around the United States. But the major press conference that was defining everybody's demonstration was held in New York by Al Sharpton, who was sitting there with the families of the victims of police killings. And that's another thing. We have moved into an era where we are dealing with leadership by victimhood. The victims, the families of the victims, mainly apolitical black folks, mainly poor people, mainly people who never had any political agenda, didn't have any political analysis. They wind up with a child or a husband or a loved one murdered by the fascist police, and then they're thrust into the limelight. And we have a bunch of attorneys that run to defend them. Usually some of them are paid by people like Sharpton or whatever, and they come to defend them, and they haven't won a case yet. And
I heard you, Dhoruba, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard you make that point in your initial press conference with announcing the formation of the Coalition to Combat Police Terrorism with Brother Kalonji Changa and former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, among others. And you made this point in that press conference that you were not there looking to speak for the families of the victims of police violence because you were part of if I understood you correctly or remember correctly, a political a vanguard or organized effort to respond to the conditions of the community, not necessarily to speak on behalf of the families. And this is, I believe, part of the point you were trying to make. Is that correct?
That's correct, because we cannot allow a leadership by victimhood. It's tragic what happened to these families, but that's the reason why, in our own way, according to our own analysis, everyone is responsible for what they know and for what they need to do based on that knowledge. So we come forth in order to demand accountability, in order to demand justice, in order to hold to account those black leaders who allow these conditions to exist. You have to understand that the militarization of the police occurred while we have the current black leaders and so-called black militants on watch. It's occurred. Mass incarceration occurred on Sharpton's and all of these folks' watch, on the post-civil rights leaders' watch. And they called for the militarization of the police in order to fight drugs that was introduced in the community by the government. They called on the government to fight it, and our community has been ravaged by it ever since.
You know, Dhoruba, President Obama just gave a major address the other day, or just last night, in fact, to the NAACP about mass incarceration. I'm wondering if you had a chance to see that and if you had any response to that, given what you've just said. And then also, and finally, I would want you just to say a word or two to all the activists coming into the struggle now, as I started off this segment with, and to those gathering, for instance, in Cleveland at the end of this month for the Black Lives Movement Conference, and to those who have joined the Black Lives Matter Conference. What might you say to all of that? So I'm asking you if you could to fold into a concluding comment your response to Obama's press conference or NAACP speech about mass incarceration, and then a word of advice to those entering the movement now.
Well, briefly, the only thing I can say, unless we develop a revolutionary analysis of our situation in the United States and begin to build sovereign thinking institutions in our community, we have the resources, we have the ability to do that. Unless we're able to do this, unless we're able to sweep away all of this miscellaneous stuff and come together and do that, then we are not going to succeed. And the major impediment to that are the types of behavior, the types of practice of people and organizations like we were just discussing. We have a bogus black bourgeois leadership, or bogus leadership of gatekeepers. We have storefront militants. We have messianic leaders who lead us around in circles. What we really need to do is understand concrete organization of masses of people around concrete issues. We are not going to legislate away white supremacy. We are not going to legally sanction the culture and the system of white supremacy. They could appoint all the prosecutors, special prosecutors they want. That's not going to change the mindset of white folks who believe in the system that they created for their privilege. And so the only way we're going to deal with that is we have to develop a revolutionary approach to these. We have to build a new abolitionist movement and not a reform movement. And one of the major problems with the Black Lives Matters is that their history, where they're coming from, is totally disconnected from the legacy of black radicalism and revolutionary thought in this country. And with that disconnection, they are unable to come up with and understand strategies and analyses that will really empower us. But I urge them, of course, to stay in the streets. I urge them to keep putting pressure on the black comprador class and on the system, and exercise the only real political power that we have in this country, and that's as a social, political, and cultural monkey wrench, an economic monkey wrench. We need to bring things to a halt. If we can't drive safely in the streets without being murdered by police, then the police shouldn't be able to come to our community at all without the threat of death, without the threat of sanction. That's what it should be. Our communities should be able to defend themselves and defend their integrity. And there's nothing wrong with that. Every human being has the right to self-defense, except black people. We only have the right to forgive. We only have the option to beg for mercy. This is a coward's mentality. This is surrender to white supremacy and the militarization of American society. So we need to understand that this is a hard struggle, and we will be characterized as haters and terrorists or whatever. But the empire, whenever we throw a brick at white supremacy in America, we also throw a brick at American empire abroad and the support of imperialism around the world.
Well, Dhoruba bin Wahad, thank you very much for joining us in this segment of I Mix What I Like here at the Real News Network. We appreciate your time.
Okay, well, I'm going to kind of pack them in real tight. The next one's about the NSA. Just been revealed by Wikileaks that they've been spreading their tentacles into allied governments, spying on allied governments. Now, spying is supposed to be the worst thing a government can do. Of course, they all do it, we all do it. So let's just play this and see what NSA's been doing.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. And welcome to this edition of the Ratner Report. Now joining us is Michael Ratner. Michael Ratner is the President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and he's also a board member of the Real News Network, and of course, a regular here at the Real News. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
It's good to be with you, Jessica, and the Real News.
So, Michael, so many revelations coming out this week, WikiLeaks revelations. Can we just talk about some of the most significant ones?
I mean, this week and last week, I actually wanted to address two topics. One is the revelations, and secondly, a report that CCR, my office, submitted to the UN on protection of not just whistleblowers, but publishers as well, and why journalists are entitled to the same protections as whistleblowers. But first, to the revelations. As you look at the website of Wikileaks, wikileaks.org, you have to remember this. Julian Assange has been in the embassy for 3 years, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He's been in custody for 5 years. And the United States, has an unprecedented investigation of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and the staff of WikiLeaks. And I just imagine to myself the courage it takes for Julian and WikiLeaks to keep going, despite the dire circumstances of Julian's physical, where he is physically and can't leave the embassy. And yet the important work of WikiLeaks is continuing. So let's have a look at even the last few days of revelations, but even the last few weeks. July 9th, a couple of days ago, more than 1 million emails from an Italian surveillance malware vendor called the Hacking Team were revealed that show the inner workings of the global surveillance industry. That's July 9th. July 8th, the day before, a title of this release is called All the Chancellor's Men. The Chancellor is Chancellor Merkel. It's July 8th. NSA surveilled 125 phone numbers of top German officials. They did it not to stop terrorism, that's obvious, as almost none of this surveillance is, if any of it. They did it for political and economic reasons, according to their own designations of coded information on these surveillance logs. For example, they wanted the reaction to the financial crisis in Germany, etc. That's July 8th. July 4th, our Independence Day. The title of the WikiLeaks release is called Bugging Brazil. We all knew something about them bugging Brazil from the earlier Snowden revelations. Now we get a top secret national security agency list of 29 Brazilian government phone numbers that were selected for surveillance, much more extensive than we knew before. That's July 4th. July 1st, TISA release, Trade and Services Agreement. Perhaps a lot of our viewers don't know what that is, but WikiLeaks releases a modern, what they called a modern journalistic holy grail, the secret core text for the largest trade deal in history, the Trade and Services Agreement. What it really ultimately does, at least what WikiLeaks showed it did in this revelation, is it reduces regulations in countries so they cannot favor local services. So if you want to hire locally, like we have these slogans, buy locally, etc., you can't. You have to essentially allow international corporations to penetrate your borders and come in and undercut your own people. And remember, TISA is one of what WikiLeaks refers to as a triumvirate of trade agreements that are really neoliberalizing the whole world. One is, of course, something they revealed earlier on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they also revealed material on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact. These are all shaped in favor of transnational corporations, and many countries are involved in it, but of course not China. So that all, the TISA just took place a few days ago, July 1st. A week before that, July 23rd, called Espionage Elysée. That's where the NSA is targeting high-level officials in France. We already knew from WikiLeaks that they targeted the last 3 presidents. And finally, I'll end on this one, although we could go on. One of my favorites, June 19th, the Saudi cables. WikiLeaks has apparently 500,000 or more cable traffic from Saudi foreign ministry to other places, its own ministries around the country, its own consulates, 500,000 cables in the Saudi foreign ministry, as I said. What Julian Assange said about this, the Saudi cables lift the lead on an increasingly erratic and secretive dictatorship that has not only celebrated its 100th beheading this year, but which has also become a menace to neighbors and itself. So it's been an extraordinary period of revelations for WikiLeaks, despite Julian Assange's confinement in an embassy.
Michael, you also mentioned that the Center for Constitutional Rights, which represents WikiLeaks and its editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, just submitted a report to help the United Nations complete their review on whistleblowers and protection of sources. This is something certainly I myself am very concerned with as a journalist, but also as a citizen. Can you just give us a breakdown of what was in that report?
Well, what we're trying to do, and I should say that a lawyer who works with me and WikiLeaks, Kerry Shankman, was the principal author of that report. It's online at the Center for Constitutional Rights website. And what we've always noticed is that whistleblowers are always out there. We have to protect whistleblowers. They don't do a very good job of it, obviously, in the United States. Obama has went after them constantly. But you also have to protect journalists like yourself, Real News, other people, because without journalists to publish the information that whistleblowers obtain, will never see the information will never see the light of day. And so you see that, and we see that particularly with my client, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, is they've gone after WikiLeaks, which is a publisher, incredibly. I mean, they've really hit the hammer on him. You know, huge investigation going on. He's confined in the embassy, no recognition of his asylum that Ecuador has given him because of this. And of course, WikiLeaks has, despite this, gone on as a publisher and, as we've said, revealed much information. But you can understand how you as a journalist or others would say, well, if to the extent the Obama administration and others are saying publishers are somehow associated with their sources, and in the same bucket, publishers, according to people like the people in this administration in the United States, can be subjected to prosecution and certainly harassment, etc. So one of the important things we've stressed in this UN report, and the UN report goes to the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, David Kay, and he hopefully will adopt some of our recommendations, submit that to the United Nations General Assembly, and we may begin to get some protections for publishers as well. So we submitted this report, and we all understand the necessity of having publishers protected, but there's also a good legal argument why publishers have to be protected. Here in the United States, there is protection for whistleblowers, I should say, for whistleblowers, particularly if they come from other countries, not our own whistleblowers. Whistleblowers from China or places the United States doesn't like, those people who flee those countries, come into the United States, ask for asylum, they get protection as a vulnerable group, considered vulnerable because they're attacked because of their free speech activities. They get asylum and they're protected. Of course, U.S. people don't, but that you would expect, unfortunately, from this country. So what we're trying to argue in this report is that publishers, like whistleblowers, are a vulnerable group. They're attacked because of their free speech, because of their freedom of expression, and they deserve to be protected as well as whistleblowers. And our hopes are at the center, our hopes are at WikiLeaks for Julian Assange, that in a world of more and more secrecy, and in a world in which, because of that secrecy, we're getting less and less democracy, that the United Nations will recognize that publishers like WikiLeaks and Julian Assange will be given the UN protection that they're entitled to. I have to say in closing, we're at a remarkable and amazing moment. We're seeing really the unraveling of governments and corporations and their secrets all over the world. They're not winning. And just remember this as I close, democracy dies behind closed doors. And all of us are in this together to protect whistleblowers and publishers so that we can have true democracy someday in this country and in the world.
All right, Michael Ratner, very powerful message there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, we have one more video to go, and this is an RT video, Russia Today. I was wrong. We weren't doing a sweep of the Real News Network. But anyway, when was the last time you heard about the plight of the Gazans? You know, I mean, maybe you heard about this flotilla that tried to, run the blockade with some medical supplies, and they got turned around again. The last time they got shot. Give edge. Let's roll this video. Operation Protective Edge.
On the first anniversary of the start of that conflict, RT's Lizzie Phelan went to Gaza to see people trying to get their lives back on track.
The airstrikes may have ended, but the recovery is still painful. Markets like this one, which typically would be bustling and crowded with people during this festive period, buying food and treats, getting ready to break their fast at sunset, are relatively empty this year. Even dates, which are a staple of that breaking of the fast meal, are proving hard to sell this year.
كان الوضع أحسن من الوضع الآن لأنه الناس من بعد الأجواء الحرب يعني شوية هيك الأمور.
Even going to pray this year has become harder as Israel's missiles also targeted mosques like this one. Added to that, Israel's 8-year siege and the closure of tunnels by Egypt, which were a crucial lifeline for basic goods, including reconstruction materials into Gaza, has meant that little of what was destroyed has been rebuilt, including Gaza's mosques.
This is the worst humanitarian condition ever Gaza witnessed. 1 year after the war, still the rubbles in the streets. This is the rubbles of thousands of Gaza houses. Tens of thousands of Gaza families who are living Ramadan days under the rubbles of their houses. This is not Gaza that we know well.
I'm in the east of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli border is just a stone's throw away, and during their offensive, they sent bulldozers into this area, which demolished many homes, like this one, which housed a family of 7 who have been made homeless and are now forced to live in a tiny container just over here to my left and spend Ramadan in there in sweltering heat. But locals say that from time to time, Israel continues to fire missiles over the border, and so even though they've already lost their homes, they are still in fear of losing their lives.
The Israeli military destroyed our homes with airstrikes and then bulldozed entire neighborhoods. People were promised that their homes would be rebuilt, but that never happened. We can't rebuild ourselves because the war left us with nothing.
You can see just how bad conditions are here. Here there's rows and rows of containers housing hundreds of people from this area who've been made homeless by those bombs and bulldozers from the war last year. Here, Samaya is preparing the family meal for iftar, the breaking of the fast tonight, and she's forced to find any bits and pieces for cooking fuel, including here cardboard and wood that comes from the floor of the temporary home in the container.
والله يعني لو كنت لو في خيمة هناك عنا وضل بيتي إني مبسوطة، أما هنا والله ما أنا مبسوطة لأني بتذكر بيتي، بتذكر كيف كنت طب أنا في الحلم نايم، بتذكر إن كنت.
Over the coming days here on RT International, we'll bring you more stories from war-torn Gaza a year after the conflict.
Another heavy night of bombardment in Gaza.
Israel has made extremely clear that it's in this for a long term.
No warning was given. This incident of the United Nations school hit by Israeli tank shells.
Protesters are clashing with Israeli troops here in the occupied West Bank.
More than a month's worth of fighting